Chapter 24. Egypt. Sitting on my terrace, feeling the afternoon sun, feeling the cold wind, but enjoying the sun, indolently, lazily, no, not lazily, at peace, a harmonious peace, as if I was listening to a symphony, surrounded as I was by the sound of the wind, the noise of the waves. In the distance, Lilith danced on the waves in a ballet that seemed choreographed from the beginning. I remembered the first time I saw her in this dance. But I didn't realize the music. So absorbed was I in myself and my private world. 3 weeks later, the walls of my world had collapsed. I doubted so much. The world was less certain, but the colors were more vibrant. And I could afford to listen to this melody. She walked up the beach, entered the terrace, laid down beside me still wet, and let her body enjoy the elements, while I tried to protect the exposed skin from the cold. We both stayed silent for a long time. She was the one who broke it.
Do you still want to know?
I tried to locate myself. I ended up in our conversation at the restaurant in Sintra. Even more than before, I replied. She smiled.
I'll have to go back a bit,
she said, turning slightly in her chair to look at me better.
In Sumer, I began to be seen as a goddess. At first as a queen, but as time passed, they started to give me another dimension. It's true that I reigned, but in my, let's say, absences, someone had to be in charge. You know, in an era when there was no technology and strength commanded, women withdrew to tasks that required less effort or aggressiveness. This led men, especially those connected to the armies, to ascend to positions of power. And in my absences, they ended up taking charge.
But did you leave frequently?
Somewhat,
she said, as if she didn't want to give me more explanations. I didn't insist. If I learned anything, it was to respect her timing, she continued.
You know that feeling you have in adolescence that time seems to pass slowly?
I nodded.
Well, after 500 years, I felt like that. Restless, as if something inside me wanted more. I needed something new. They had turned me into little more than a decorative figure. I thought everything was done there. There was nothing new, there was even resistance to novelty. People had become prosperous, complacent. But I also realized that it would be difficult to assert myself as a woman elsewhere. With the Sumerians, it happened because they were the ones who gathered around me. I didn't want to distance myself again, you know. Quite the opposite. I wanted to get off the pedestal they had put me on.
I understood her so well. I like being admired, but not idolized. You don't really consider yourself above anyone, do you?
No, I don't.
But do you realize how extraordinary you are?
I am the product of extraordinary circumstances. But that doesn't make me different from you. I feel like you, suffer like you, long like you.
Extraordinary by circumstance, but not special. Unique but equal. Aren't we all fundamentally like that, unique but equal? She continued.
I headed west with one of my generals, still quite young. But we set off without a destination. I wanted to come alone, but they wouldn't let me. They wanted someone to accompany and protect me, and he ended up volunteering to come with me. Sometime later, we arrived at a location not far from what is now Cairo, a little further south. I saw that the lands were excellent, fertile like few others, although at the time of arrival, I didn't know why. I set out to try to build something, but then the flood came and destroyed everything. I started again, and the next year it happened again. I realized that all that destruction also resulted in a deposition of sediments that made the lands extraordinarily rich.
Not everything was bad about the destruction.
Quite the opposite. Thanks to it, there was potential. Without it, the lands would have been perfectly useless, and the desert would have extended to the riverbank. But moving on. The native peoples were still organized in small clans that warred with each other, living in the most perfect animalism. Cannibalism was common. While I tried to understand the rhythms of nature, the best time to sow, to harvest, my general was aggregating, through the respect he could impose by pure brute force, some of the clans. After some time, we founded a settlement, Inebhedge, which slowly and with difficulty began to grow.
That settlement didn't last long, did it?
It survived for millennia.
She said, laughing. Millennia? I've never heard of it.
You know, the Greeks called it Mennefer, which was the Egyptian name of Pharaoh Ppi. Later, in Coptic, the name became Menfer. You probably know it as Memphis.
Of course. I do. So, the original name was
Inebhedge, which means the white walls. But just out of curiosity, you should know that an Egyptian historian, Manetho, referred to Memphis as Haikupitar, which means the house of Ka and Ptah, because of its temples, which he wrote in Greek in a way that would read something like Originaly. This form passed into Latin as Egyptus,
which leads to the modern name of Egypt.
Right. But going back, after we figured out how to store the grain we were planting, the population really started to grow under the apparent rule of my general. I say apparent because, in the end, he was my front. We taught them how to sow cereals, to harvest them, to store them, to ferment barley and make beer. We taught them to plant the vineyards and make wine. We began to absorb neighboring clans. As we had more people, constructions increased, complexity increased.
And before you knew it, there was a new civilization flourishing.
Completely. But the interesting thing is that people saw how my general treated me with deference, which, although they didn't know, was veneration, and that I didn't submit to him and treated him as an equal. Now the only relationship in which they could conceive such, although still unusual, was between siblings. And that's what we were considered. Siblings.
And wasn't that considered strange? We are somehow programmed to seek genetic diversity.
If you look at this in the light of that time, no. The populations were very small, the ties of consanguinity were very high, and it was not uncommon for very close relatives to marry. The important thing was to ensure the future of the clan.
I understand.
Meanwhile, for organizational reasons, it was imperative to put an end to the cults that each clan had to its private gods. The differences in worship would lead to more serious things, no doubt.
Yes, even today believers in religions that claim that God is love and that the greatest value is peace are at war with each other.
Which is a contradiction, to say the least. Stupid, don't you think?
Absolutely.
But that's why it was necessary to organize a religion with the remnants of the cults of the most important clans, mixed with what I knew. The best possible representation for the untouchable source of life was undoubtedly the sun. Over time, mythology grew on its own. Names, characteristics, personalities had to be given to the gods. They had to be made close, human, they had to have dramas, rivalries, they had to be wise, but they also had to err. And by bringing them all under the same cult, unity was created. Do you understand this?
Completely. She took a deep breath before continuing.
As you may guess, my general.
Osiris. She laughed.
Yes, Osiris. He eventually died, and the kingdom passed to his son.
Wasn't he also your son, Horus?
No, he was the son of one of Osiris's concubines. However, since they considered us united in everything, even though they didn't know it, he was also considered my son. And believe me, I treated him as such.
And why did you call yourself Isis and not Lilith, or Lilichu?
Because I wanted to move forward. I didn't want to be related to the Lilith who was at the beginning of time. I didn't want divinity.
But you ended up having it anyway, didn't you?
I did. I ended up being considered wise, then the one who knew almost everything. As mythology evolved, so did the story of the name of Ra, the secret name that gave all the powers to whoever pronounced it, which would be the only thing I wouldn't know. This story merged with the stories that the descendants of Adam passed orally from one to another when they were subjugated by Egypt. And in a strange way, chance, destiny, call it what you want, I began to be identified as the same character. Perhaps because I was the image of the unsubmissive and unsinkable woman.
But tell me, weren't you in Egypt as you were in summer?
What do you mean?
Establishing things for a long time, leading.
No. I thought it would be better not to. I was annoyed that they worshipped me. That they took me as something different, which I didn't think I was. And so I let myself slide into all the other possible roles, into ordinary lives.
And meanwhile, Isis begins to be considered a goddess, granddaughter of the sun and daughter of the earth and the sky.
Yes. And at the same time, I lived with the people who worshipped her.
Why did you choose to do so?
I needed to live, to learn, to absorb everything. I was hungry for knowledge, and I knew that I wouldn't get it empirically, sitting in an ivory tower. I had to feel things on my skin, I had to feel my condition as a woman to assert myself even more.
But that doesn't mean you had to end up being submissive, did it?
My dear, submission is often in the eyes of the one who wants to subdue. And never forget that cunning is women's greatest weapon,
she said with a mischievous smile. I laughed. What she said was true. Being and the appearance of being are two completely different things, and we, those who don't have these grand stories, live in a world of appearances, in such a way that often, we don't know our own reality, only its illusion. The sun disappeared on the horizon, leaving rags of clouds with orange tones, and at the same time, a strong humidity began to permeate me. That's why I suggested, what if we go inside?